And I've loved hearing how God has been working in you as individuals through what Dong and Adam have shared, and what He's doing between in you as a wider church and growing this young church. So good on you for being here this weekend. But not only is it really good for relationship building, it's so good to be able to put some dedicated time aside just to sink our teeth into God's Word, right? So those of you that have been on church camps before, you'll know just how sometimes you can actually get just a much more in-depth picture of God's Word, but also how you can just spend time together talking about it and discussing it. And my prayer is that this will be a profound thing for you, that you will see the treasure that's here in the text, that you won't remember Dan Evers, but you'll remember God's Word and what He has to teach you as you leave this weekend. And friends, we're going to ask this really fundamental and vital question, maybe one of the most important questions that you'll ever ask yourself, or I'll ask you in fact. And my question is, how big is your God? How big is your God? So your concept of God, your understanding of your God, will shape the way you live your lives. Sometimes theologians, they speak in big terms, things that are a bit convoluted and a bit hard to understand. But friends, what is the most helpful thing for us as we wrestle with life at the coalface, in its raw pain, in its challenges, is our understanding of who God is. See, what we need most is a sound theology, a sound understanding of the God of the Bible. And I hope that in this story we can just see a little bit more the wonder of the character of God and how that makes a difference in your day-to-day lives. We're going to look at two important concepts now. I'll just get the definitions out of the way a little bit. They're not words that we use typically in everyday language, but we use them a little bit in church. And those are the words of sovereignty and providence. Sovereignty and providence. God's sovereignty, I'll come back to it, and maybe I'll even quiz you a little bit later, but we'll come back to the idea of sovereignty is that God is in ultimate control. He has supreme power. There's nothing in the universe that is out of His rule and His control. And the second term is that of providence. And that is very closely linked, but I think it's more helpfully presented for us in the story of Joseph. We'll see that God is in control, but providence has His control at the level of His care, His governance, and His active work within the world that we live in. So there's sovereignty in control, but providence, or His providential hand, is He's using that control for His good purposes. It's a very proactive word, a proactive understanding that He's weaving, and there's the family of the weavers here, and we've seen the tapestry. He's weaving His good purposes under His control. So we'll just get that out of the way, sovereignty and providence. Well, friends, I wonder if any of you have been watching the series Alone. Anyone Alone fans here? Some of you? Yeah? Okay. No spoilers, all right. I don't know what's going on in the Australian series. It's a fun series to watch. My family, we've been getting into it together, watching all the American versions, and now we see the Australian version of Alone. I do give you a little bit of a heads up that the language, the frustration in some of the language in the Australian version is a little bit confronting, but the idea of it, if you're not familiar, is that people are thrown into the wilderness with only 10 things, and they have to outlast each other to see how long they last. And again, guys, I hope, what was your names, by the way? Rachel and Michael. I hope this isn't ruining it for everybody when I'm going to say this, but what you discover in the series is it's not the food, it's not the environment, though some of the environment is really harsh, that sends people home, that they tap out. But over and over and over again, now sometimes there's medical reasons, over and over again, the reason they tap out is because they ache for people, for relationship. They long to be in relationship. It's a fascinating study for us understanding how we're wired. And friends, we're going to look at this idea of being alone Where is God in the depths of our despair? Where is God when we're at the bottom of the pit of life? Are we truly alone? That's what we're going to look at now. Has anyone ever heard of the astronaut, Michael Collins? I'd never heard of him until recently. Dom has. Maybe he's used this in a Gungahlin Bible Church illustration. Mike Collins. He was up there with those two guys, Buzz Aldrin, and who's the other guy? Neil Armstrong. Yeah, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin. Mike Collins was there up there when man first stepped onto the moon. All right, so Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, they take this step. One small step for mankind, that sort of thing. That was profound, right? That was incredible. But apparently Mike Collins was up there in the in the spaceship, and his job was to go round the back of the moon on his own, the dark side of the moon, while these two guys stepped onto the moon. And there's this statement that Mission Control made at this point about Michael Collins. They said, not since Adam, all right, so Adam on the earth on his own, not since Adam has any human known such solitude as Mike Collins. Known such solitude as Mike Collins. This man was truly alone. But was he really? Was he really? Today we look at the person of Joseph, and we discover that in his aloneness, God never left him alone. And a catchphrase, if you remember nothing from today, all right, nothing from today, I want you to remember that in the light of Jesus, he was forsaken so that you and I never have to be. He was truly isolated. He was truly alone so that you and I never, ever have to be. See, this story here, the whole story of Joseph actually really should be seen through the lens of Jesus, shouldn't it? It's too easy for Sunday school teachers, and I love Sunday school teachers who do a fantastic job, but it's too easy at times, isn't it, to have these great Old Testament stories and just come up with the moral to the story, right? And jump straight from Joseph to you and me. And there's some good teaching principles in this. So we'll discover, run from temptation, be good to your master, all these different things. There's some good morals in there, but that's not really what the story's truly about. See, we need to go through the lens, or I don't know, like an hourglass that you would turn on its side, the neck of the hourglass. That is Jesus, right? We need to come through that through him, before we get to us. Jesus is a bit like the key on the map, those old-fashioned things, the paper maps. Some of you mightn't be familiar with them, but there was a key, right, on the bottom of the map that had the squiggly lines and the shapes that showed us how to interpret the map. Jesus is the key. And so, friends, as we come to this story, we must understand it in the light of Jesus. Well, before we get to the Bible reading and we come to the first little installment of Joseph, we must understand how we get to Joseph. And we can just take couple of minutes now to figure out how we got there. If you have your Bibles there, it's vital that we go back to part of the Bible a little bit earlier to his grandfather Abraham, his great-grandfather, Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12. A few pages over from Genesis 37, where we're going to go to a little bit later. Genesis 12 and verses 1 to 3. If you're not familiar with this is fundamental to unlocking the rest of the Bible and the rest of this story. Verse 1, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. 3 key promises really are embedded in this, and this unfolds throughout the rest of the Old Testament and ultimately the hourglass in Jesus and then back to you and I. 3 promises. Those of you that have been familiar, it's likely you've heard this taught a number of times. We can't be too familiar with this. This is so familiar. There's 3 blessings. Anyone like to unlock them there in front of you? I've memorized it by L-O-B. First one, L. It's the land, right? So God's saying to Abram, he's not Abraham yet, the father of many nations. He's saying, Abram, I'm going to give you a special land, a place of your own. It's a bit of a funny O. It could be a P as well. So, someone else? Rachel, was it? You're just answering all the questions. Oh, that was Claire. Okay, Claire. Offspring. L-O, offspring. So you're going to be a father of many, many nations. All people. Many people are going to come through. And the last one, blessing. Yeah, good. You guys know this. It's awesome. We need to set this at the very beginning. He says that Abram is going to be a blessing to all nations. All people are going to know this blessing. So this is the very foundation, the background for where we arrive at Joseph. And there's a question here is, are these promises going to be fulfilled? Is God faithful to this? And we arrive in chapter 37. Jump with me back to chapter 37 now, where we're going to have our first installment, our first Bible reading. As we see that Joseph is the son of Jacob, whose father was Isaac, whose grandfather was Abraham. Is God faithful to these 3 promises? They're a small family group. They're in the land of Canaan, so there's one, land. They're arrived. They're not a great nation, and they're quite an insular group of people by the looks of things. They're not yet a blessing to all the nations. So that's our question mark, and that's what's hanging over the story of Joseph, are these 3 promises going to be fulfilled? All right, now's the time to delve into the text. So we're going to look at the first little installment in chapter 37, and I think Aggie and Imi are going to read for us. As they come up and as they read for us, we need to be asking ourselves, and I want to ask you this, whereabouts does God feature in the story? Okay, where does God feature? And I'm going to keep asking you this over these couple of days. Where does God feature? And secondly, how do you reckon Joseph felt? Okay, feelings, how did he feel? And where does God feature? All right, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, church. My name is Aggie. I'm going to read to you Book of Genesis, chapter 37, 1 to 17. Chapter 37, verse 1. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, and his father kept the saying in mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. He said to them, Here I am. So he said to him, Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, What are you seeking? I am seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock. And the man said, They have gone away, for I heard them say, Let us go down to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. I pass it to Imogen.
They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, Let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, Shed no blood. Cast him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. And they took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. When Judah said to his brothers, What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders, passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, The boy is gone, and I, where shall I go? Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. And he identified it and said, It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard.
Thanks, Imi. Thank you, Aggie. Okay. Well, here we have the first little installment of Joseph. We meet Joseph and we see that he gets into all sorts of strife right from the start. Well, the two questions I had for you was, how do you reckon Joseph was feeling? And where does God feature? And well, let's just for a few moments explore the passage together. I'll take us through the passage, and then you can help me answer that question as we come to the end of it. So, chapter 37. We're introduced to Joseph as a 17-year-old boy, aren't we? He's not quite an adult. In fact, we're told that he is a boy. And he's out there in the sheep paddocks. I grew up on a sheep farm. He's more active in shepherding than I was as young 17-year-old, but he is there with his brothers, and it's likely that his brothers are quite a bit older. Okay, so these guys may be in their 30s or even early 40s, and Joseph's a 17-year-old. As he's amongst them, we're told that he brings a good report. No, he brings a bad report on his older brothers. He's a bit of a he rats out on his brothers here, it seems, telling his dad that they've been behaving badly. Now, the text doesn't really give us an understanding whether he's making up stories. He's just a troublemaker. It's unlikely, from what we discover more about Joseph, that he's not. Maybe he's just telling the truth. These guys and this family are a messed up family. Early on, we discover that Reuben, the eldest child, he has slept with his dad's concubine. We discover that the next two down in line, Simeon and his other brother, I don't have his name here, but they've caused all sorts of problems with murdering and stirring up strife. There's all sorts of problems with this family. And so Joseph, he brings this bad report on his brothers. And yet, in stark contrast to this bad report, verse 3, we see Jacob, or Israel. He has two names at this point. And he does what? Well, how does he treat Joseph? How does he think of Joseph? He loves Joseph more than any of his sons because he was the son of his old age. So the unexpected child to his wife Rachel that he'd thought he would never have children to. As a result, though, there was all sorts of hatred and jealousy that stirred up between the brothers. And particularly now that Jacob presents Joseph with this robe of many colours. Verse 3. Now, I don't know if you know, but it's uncertain as to really what this robe was really like. The literal translation is it's a robe of really long sleeves. I don't know, one of those ones that hide your hands, like really, really long sleeves. But the interpretation could be multicolored, technicolored, beautiful, but it doesn't really matter, does it? It could be this really multicolored coat, but the point is that it's an ornate coat that's given to him as a favorite child. And if any of us know anything about parenting, having favoritism is a bad idea. At the moment, my 18-year-old son and my 15-year-old son are the only two that are at home. And as brothers, I do my best to treat them equally, but there's always rivalry. I'm an oldest child and I have a younger brother. There was always rivalry. But this goes to another level. There is favoritism here, and the word that keeps being coming across over and over again is that his brothers hated him. His brothers hated him. And in verse 4 there, they couldn't speak peacefully to him. Or in other words, they couldn't say a nice word about him. Whenever they interacted, there was always something negative or horrible that was said. As the story goes on, we discover that Joseph has these two dreams. And they're remarkable dreams. They're well-known dreams. There's this dream of the bowing down of the sheaves. And then the second dream is the dream of the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down. Joseph, we don't know whether he's puffed up with pride. It could be. Or he's just really quite silly and ignorant. But he goes and tells his brothers, which is really not a good idea. He already knows that they hate him. But he trots on to his other 11 brothers and he says, "Hey guys, I had this dream. You are going to bow down to me." Like, why would you do such a thing? He's a young 17-year-old, and then these older brothers are already insecure and threatened and jealous of this favoritism. So he does that, and we're told in verse 5, they hated him even more. And then in verse 8, again, the same refrain is, they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. Hatred is seething in this family amongst these brothers. But now Joseph, even more foolishly, I would have kept my mouth shut, but no. He has this second dream, and then he goes to them again, and he tells, guys, I've got another dream, and this time it's not just you that are going to bow down to me, but mum and dad are. Now, culturally, this is really disgraceful. Culturally, you shouldn't do this. A father, in particular, an elderly father, is someone you should always show great respect to. Maybe he should have just kept his mouth shut. For his father, he rebukes him, he tells him off. And now, how does his brothers treat him? It's not just hatred, verse 11, but they were what? They were jealous of him. They were jealous of him and hated him. But now his father takes this on board, a little bit like Mary with Jesus and the prophecy there. His father, he considers this. He keeps it in mind, wondering what will come about. Well, this is the context for now what happens. Joseph and his brothers are shepherds. His brothers are out pasturing the sheep, and his dad wants to check in on them. And so, verse 12, his dad sends Joseph off to go and check on them. Now, it's not just around the corner. This is the distance of going probably from Tuggeranong all the way down to Cooma. Okay, and he has to walk. Well, he might have a camel to ride on, but we're told that he's walking when his brothers see him. So he goes a long way to check on his brothers. His father wants to see how he's doing. And as he does, we discover that he actually chuffs off in his ornate robe, in his robe of many colours. I don't know if I'd be wearing my best clothes if I'd be walking from Tuggeranong to Cooma to go and check on my brother. No, but he does. Maybe he's then just still wanting to show to his brothers, hey, I'm the special one. I'm the one that stands out. I'm the favourite. And so he takes off and he arrives nearby, and he seems to get lost, doesn't he? So have a look at verse 15. A man, a random guy, finds him wandering in the fields. And he asks him, where are you going? What are you seeking? And Joseph says, please tell me where my brothers are. And this man coincidentally has not only knows his brothers, but he's heard a conversation about where they're going next. A random man finds Joseph wandering in a random field, and here, this coincidence, which I don't think is coincidence at all, God is weaving and working his purposes, and he tells him that they have now gone to Dothan. Gone to Dothan. This town, or this place, only appears one more place in the scriptures. And it's quite significant. We'll come back to Dothan in a little while. Well, as the story goes on, and we need to keep moving here, we discover that they conspired to kill him. They see him coming in his ornate robe, his robe of many colours, and they say, hey, let's kill him. We hate him so much. I mean, this is real hatred. There's been times where I haven't got along with my brother, but there's no way I would ever think about killing him. These brothers then, they take him, they strip him of his robe, they throw him into a pit, and he's actually rescued by Reuben. Reuben there, the eldest child, he says, let's not kill him, let's just put him in the pit. And Reuben has this idea that he might be able to come back later and rescue him out of the pit. But as Joseph is thrown down into this dark pit, thankfully there's no water in it, but I don't imagine he's having a good time down there, because I reckon it would have hurt, it would have been lonely, it would have been dark. And we're told a little bit later on in chapter 42 that he cried out to his brothers. Imagine that, calling out, Reuben, save me, Simeon, get me out of here. He's despairing, he's desperate, he's alone. And then verse 25. Again, coincidentally, as they sit down to eat, and these brothers are pretty callous, right? They're just having a casual meal while their brother's crying out in the pit. Coincidentally, or God incidentally, a caravan of Ishmaelites come up from Gilead. And Judah has this great idea. Judah thinks, hey, we can actually make some money from this. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine wanting to get some cash for your brother, selling him into people trafficking? So he sells them to the Ishmaelites. They take him for 20 shekels of silver, and off into Egypt he goes. We discover then that they conspire this devious and deceptive plan to let Jacob know that he'd been killed when really he'd been sold into slavery. Jacob is grieved and he mourns. And then we hear in verse 36 that meanwhile, as this is all happening, that he is sold to Potiphar's house, who is captain of the guard. All right, let's get to Potiphar, and we will... in fact, I need to ask you those two questions. Firstly, before chapter 39, where's God in all this? Where's God in all this? Bit of a trick question. Where does God feature in the passage? Do we see him at all? Well, overtly we don't, do we? The name of God or the work of God is zero. It doesn't occur in that chapter 37. But we'll discover a little bit later that there's more going on. And how do you reckon Joseph felt? What's going on for Joseph? What's some of the emotions? There's a chance you might be able to share what you put yourself in his shoes, in his sandals for a moment. He's going from being loved by his father to this place. How do you reckon he felt? Any ideas? Betrayed. Yeah, betrayal is just so vivid, isn't it? These brothers are meant to love me and care for me. They've betrayed me. Okay, excellent. Couple more. Lost. Yeah, he's actually going to a place, a foreign country. He doesn't know the language, right? He doesn't know the people. He's absolutely lost. One more. What other feeling? Scared. Yeah, scared. I'd be petrified. My brothers, they want to kill me, let alone throw me into a pit, let alone sell me into people trafficking. I would have been utterly petrified. There was one more. What was it? Yeah, separated. That's excellent. He's abandoned. He's totally separated and abandoned from the father and the family he loves. My goodness. So let's just feel the weight of what he's going through. And then he's stripped of his clothes. It's likely he's trekked a long way to Egypt behind a camel, likely have very little clothing on. And then he's put in the slave market for display, again, likely stripped of his clothing. That's significant, being stripped of his garments here. And he's there in a meat market and sold off. A 17-year-old boy. This is quite a traumatic and horrific experience. Okay, let's find out what happens next in the story. Chapter 39, let's turn with us, and I think Jack is going to read for us.
Chapter 39, verses 1 to 23. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me my master, who has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge, He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, 'The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house.' As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, 'This is the way your servant treated me,' his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed."
Thank you, Jack. Have you ever been accused of doing something that you actually didn't do? Ever been in a situation where you've been unjustly treated? I think most of us have lived a little while would say that there's times that there's been injustice in our lives. But to this extreme, this is really confronting. In fact, I deal with prisoners every day who will testify, "I've done nothing wrong." I don't know whether that's the case, but it's horrific, isn't it? Particularly when you don't have any cause to justify what you've done. If you are defenseless and there's no way to defend what you've done. Joseph's left in this situation. He's been sold to Potiphar, and it's, again, a God incidence, not a coincidence, that he is the head, the captain of the guard. Now, we see right from the start the place of God in Joseph's slavery. What are we told in verse 2? The Lord was what? The Lord was with him. Now God appears on the scene. The Lord is with Joseph in this dire situation. Joseph is here at the bottom of the rung in Egypt, a young slave. But because the Lord was with him, the Lord caused all that he did to succeed, and he found favor in his master's eyes. Now, the time frame here, it runs really quickly. The story speeds up very fast. But here it's likely to be 13, maybe 15 years. It doesn't happen overnight. And this is a constant theme in this story, that in God's work, in Joseph's life, there is a lot of waiting and hardship and toil that are between the lines. Joseph doesn't seem to do anything to deserve this, does it? But the Lord is with him. Here we see demonstrated a God of grace. Joseph hasn't impressed God. He hasn't acted in any sacrificial way or done anything ritualistic or religious, but God is with him. And even Potiphar, his master, sees that the Lord is with him and all that he had. So Potiphar's pretty happy about this. So he gives him charge over everything in his home. And this is remarkable that someone would entrust a foreigner and a slave with this. And then we see in verse 6 that Joseph is a little bit like Dom Fiocco. He's handsome in form and appearance. He's someone who impresses Potiphar's wife, and she looks at him and she tempts him and pleads with him, and we're told day after day she wants him to sleep with him. And Joseph's response is remarkable. Verse 9, let's have a look. Verse 8. Behold, because of my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he's put everything that he has in my charge, follow along, he is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. And then get this. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against my master? Does he say that? That's almost what you would expect. How can I do this great wickedness and not sin against Potiphar, his master, but sin against who? Sin against God. Here Joseph has this understanding that even though he could actually be benefiting from this, he could get maybe promotion. There might be a way for him to get out of slavery. And a slave was not permitted to marry. Here's a young guy in the prime of his life, and here's a woman who wants to sleep with him. He could have benefited in all sorts of ways, but he has this understanding that to do this would be to sin against God himself. Joseph has this comprehension that he, in fact, is not alone. God is a God to be feared. God is a God who is conscious of his actions. And Joseph here, remarkably, day after day, he's being asked to come and sleep with this woman. He flees. The language of fleeing, or that Joseph fled, is there 4 times in the passage. Joseph fled, Joseph fled, Joseph fled. And this time his garment is stripped from him yet again. His garment is left in the hands of Potiphar's wife as he flees. And he's there acting in a way that wants to honour his God. Well, Joseph there, we discover, is falsely accused. He's framed. There's fabrication as to what he's actually done, and he cannot have an opportunity to explain his cause, for he's thrown into an Egyptian jail. This jail here is probably unlike in the jails that I've been to, 7 or 8 jails in New South Wales, in the ACT jail. It's described here as a dungeon, or the language actually changes. We'll see it a little bit later this morning, that it changes to being that of a pit. He returns to this horrible pit of a dungeon, of a cell. And yet in verse 21 we have that 3-letter word that appears, and we should pay attention whenever it appears in Scripture, but, and particularly if it says but God, or but the Lord. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. Note here, friends, where is it that he knows the love of God? Where is it that he knows the love of God? The steadfast love. This is the language of God's unrelenting, his unconditional and constant love. Where does he know it? It's there in the prison. And this should strike us. For in the mess of life, when troubles of life, when things go wrong, we often think that it's when we're rescued and we're on the outside, when we're out of the pit, that's when we can comprehend the love of God. No, for Joseph, it's right here in the heart of his suffering, in his injustice, that he knows the love of God. And we're told then again in this situation in the jail, he goes from being the bottom of the rung to being entrusted charge even in the prison. Why? Is it because Joseph's impressive? Well, it's likely he has good management skills and he has a good head, but the only reason that we're told over and over again as to what gives him success in these contexts is what? The Lord is with him. The Lord is with him. Now, friends, it's important here not to quickly jump to you and I and say, hey, when I'm in real trouble, I might end up in Goulburn jail. I know that one day the Lord is going to lift me up out of that situation and I'm going to be successful and I'm going to be Prime Minister of Australia or the next King of England. That's not the paradigm here. But what we should be grasping is this constant affirming and affirmation here is that God never left him. God never leaves him here. So Joseph, the question of how did he feel? Well, I imagine there would have been quite considerable devastation, discouraged, disappointment. He'd finally got to a place of responsibility in Potiphar's home. And now he's back in the pit again. Here, Joseph has all sorts of means for anger, for bitterness, for injustice, unjust rage at the way he's been treated. But in all this, Joseph has this comprehension that God never leaves him nor forsakes him. Now we need to jump to what that means for us. See, Joseph here, he's living in this broken world. He's living in this broken situation where all sorts of trial and heartache have come his way. And for us, we might not end up as slaves, God willing. That's not going to happen, or in a pit or in a jail. But again, we don't have to live too long to know that life has all sorts of brokenness. And in this assurance, we can see that the person of Jesus, he doesn't step away from our suffering or our broken world. What does he do? He steps into our world. He steps forward and he becomes what is described in that title of Emmanuel. Emmanuel meaning what? God is with us. Friends, we have a shadow of the person of Jesus in the story of Joseph. God is with him in this suffering. We also have a shadow of the person of Jesus where Jesus himself is stripped of his ornate robe. Jesus is sold for a handful of coins. Jesus himself is abandoned by those who are closest to him. And yet Jesus knows that he is the one that God has sent. In chapter 42 of this story, we'll learn that Joseph is convinced that even though his brothers sold him, God sent him. His brothers sold him, but God sent him. God's hand in man's wicked actions. Jesus himself was sent so that this broken world could be restored and our relationship with him could be brought back into reconciliation. Friends, this morning, I just want us to leave with this confidence that in our distress, in our brokenness, we have a God who will never, ever leave us. Jesus, at the end of Matthew 28, he says, "Lo, I am with you," or "Behold, I am with you." Lo is the old-fashioned English. "I am with you even to the end of the age." I heard a story of I think he was a Vietnamese young man whose name was Lo. And he read that passage, "Lo, I am with you to the end of the age." And he said, "Well, yeah, he's with me." And friends, that applies to all of us. He is our Emmanuel. And as I stated right at the beginning, Jesus, as he hung on that cross and he cried that cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me?" God the Father turns his back on the Son because the Son takes on the sin of the world, sin of you and I. He is forsaken by his Father so that you and I never, ever have to be forsaken. What a wonderful message that is, right? Joseph knew forsakenness, but you and I never have to know that, for God is always with us. And this is the wonder of the gospel of Jesus, that he would dwell amongst sinners like you and I. Now, again, some of the crimes that I see and hear about, or don't see, but I hear about, are horrific crimes. And yet our crime is universal. It's a crime against God in us offending God by living our own way. Our state, our deserved state, is abandonment. But Jesus took it on himself. And this is a wonderful, wonderful assurance for those of us who think, God would never dwell with me. God would not want anything to do with me. The prisoners say to me often, if you really knew what I'm like, if you really knew what I've done, you would know that God would want nothing to do with me. But Jesus, as he hung there on that cross, he looked at those in front of him who were crucifying him, were mocking him. And do you remember what he said to his Father? He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Friends, the heart of God and the heart of Jesus is stirred by our sin, is stirred by our brokenness. He is a God of great compassion, and he steps into our world and he says, I will not leave you or forsake you. This is the grace that's offered in the gospel. Friends, this morning, remember, as we come to the story here of Joseph and as we see that God was with him, we can be assured that in our brokenness, he is with us, and he is with us for all eternity because of the saving work of Jesus. Let me pray. Father, we realize that our world is just so messed up. Now, Lord, we often just feel alone. There is all sorts of times when we're overwhelmed. We just feel like things are so disappointing and not going the way we hoped they would. But we thank you for the assurance we have now, and we thank you in particular for the grace of Jesus, who says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, those of us who are burdened and weighed down by our sin, that you welcome us and you say that you will never leave us or forsake us. Thank you for Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.